Okay, last time we talked about freedom of speech, and I hope what you came away from that with is some questions and some research and maybe not as many answers as you might have thought you would have. It's not as simple as you might think. Well, that is equally true of another part of the First Amendment, what is known as the Freedom of Religion and Establishment Clause. It says in the First Amendment that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's two in one. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, that's called the Establishment Clause, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, the Free Exercise Clause. We're going to lump those both together into this talk. Now that seems pretty straightforward, again, much like freedom of speech, but again, there are so few words that they lend themselves to vast interpretations. Also, it is in and of itself somewhat contradictory. Let's think for a minute about, say, a chaplain in the military. Well, by the federal government using its monies to establish an office in the military that is religious in nature, doesn't that violate the Establishment Clause? And yet, if I'm a soldier serving overseas and I have no way to practice my religious beliefs because the government hasn't provided a chaplain for me, wouldn't that violate my Free Exercise Clause? So in some ways, this amendment is in and of itself contradictory, and that's presented some problems. The second problem, much like the problem with speech, is definition. What is religion? Now, if you're taking this class at the Master's College, you probably have a good idea of what your religion is, and I appreciate that because it's probably mine, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's religion in general, okay? And throughout American history, as religion has been defined, what do you do with that? How do we prevent free exercise of religion getting apart from anybody doing whatever they want? What is defined as a religion? Okay, let me again give you an illustration. Let's say I am in prison for a crime, and I form a religion while I'm there with my cellmates that part of our dietary requirements are that we must receive steak and beer every night. That's part of the dietary requirements of our new religion. Does the government have to provide me with that? Because if they don't, they would be prohibiting my practice of religion. That was actually a court case. Well, we think of this, and when we think of freedom of religion, usually we think of the ideas of separation in church and state. And so I want to talk a little bit about the history of that, because that's something as well that's got a little bit of misinformation out there. At the time of our founding, there were basically three ideas out there with regard to religion. And one of those was the idea put out there by Jefferson in a letter he wrote, not a statement as president, but a letter he wrote around 1802 to some Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut. And he used that phrase, wall of separation, that I'm sure you've heard of. What Jefferson was intending in that, and Jefferson's great concern, not just in that letter, but in general, was not what we think of as a wall of separation to keep government out of religion. His concern was keeping religion out of government. Jefferson was somebody who was very concerned about the fervors of religion impacting lawmaking decisions, and he wanted a wall of separation to make sure that religion didn't impact government. Another gentleman from way back in American history, Roger Williams, he was an early founder of Connecticut, a good 150 years before Jefferson, but his ideas about separation of church and state had a very long run, and he also believed in separation of church and state, but for the opposite reason. He did not want government to corrupt religion. Unlike Jefferson, who was worried religion would corrupt government, Roger Williams was worried that government would corrupt religion. So he wanted religion separate from the state because he was concerned that the negative influences of government would ruin religion. The third idea, and the one most prevalent at the founding, was by James Madison. You'll remember he was one of the key players at the Constitutional Convention. And his take on this was that a plurality of religions would ensure religious freedom. That is to say, he was hoping that the multiplicity of faiths in America would help establish religious freedom because no one would get the majority. He took this idea into politics in many different ways. His idea of faction in Federalist 10 is wonderful. But his goal was that the more faiths there were, Baptists, Presbyterians, Methodists, this, the less likely it was that one would dominate. But what do you do here? The Supreme Court has had to deal with this, and this idea of wall of separation, keeping religion and government apart, is virtually untenable. As we said, it's simply impossible to keep those two things separate. We have In God We Trust on our coins. We have chaplains in the military. We have prayer before Congress begins session. We have never thought of ourselves as a nation that could totally separate religion and government. And when you don't totally separate it, then your conversation is about how much mixture there is. And that's what the Supreme Court has had to deal with. And as they've dealt with this, they have become more, the word to learn here is accommodationist. Accommodationist. That is to say, how do we accommodate religions without favoring one over another, or, more challengingly, not favoring religion over irreligion? In other words, how do we accommodate that? Let me give you an illustration. Let's say somebody is a Seventh-day Adventist, and as a result, according to their faith, does not work on Saturdays. Because of that, they get laid off. Are they entitled to unemployment insurance? That was actually a Supreme Court case, because they argued that, well, you know, if you don't give me unemployment insurance simply because I got discharged because of my religious beliefs, you're violating my free exercise of religion. Okay, other ways this has come up. Should public school monies be used to purchase textbooks for private schools that are religious based? Should public school funds be used to help students and those who can't afford to take, say, SATs or AP tests? Should they receive financial discounts? All kinds of court cases come up as they try to figure out what ways can we accommodate religion without either giving an advantage to one religious group over another, or giving an advantage to religion over irreligion. And the solution that they've come up with came out of a court case in 1971, Lemon versus Kurtzman, and it established what was known as the Lemon test. And here are the three criterion for the Lemon test. This is what the Supreme Court begins to look at when it is trying to decide whether a law violates the establishment of religion. The law must have a valid secular purpose. That is to say, the law must have a valid secular purpose. It cannot be a law about religion. It has to be a law about something else, something unrelated to religion. Okay? Second part of this test is that its primary effect must be neither to advance or inhibit religion. And the third one is that it must not lead to excessive government entanglement with religion. So it has to have a secular purpose. It cannot be a law that either advances or hinders religion, and it must not excessively entangle government with religion. Now, usually the first one of these Lemon tests is really not out there, but the second and third parts of this are the one that get involved. But let me give you an illustration from the past that has to do with this. What if you are a religious group that as part of your religion practices animal sacrifice? Okay, that's part of what you do. Does that violate local laws about cruelty to animals? If it does the government have the right to shut down your establishment because as a part of your religion, you engage in animal sacrifice? That was actually a court case from South Florida several years ago. So establishing religions, rules about establishment of religion, a lot of confusion with that and a lot of learning going on in the Supreme Court even today, and these are coming up every session. The other part, besides the established part, is the free exercise clause. And this also is not as simple as it seems. Congress shall make no law prohibiting a free exercise of religion. Well, we can go back to that case in South Florida about animal sacrifice, but there are other issues that come up with this. And this has to do with the issue of belief versus conduct. In other words, the Supreme Court has generally decided that I can believe whatever I want without government interference. But the government does have the right to regulate my behavior. Okay, so I can believe this is true about faith. My faith lends me to this belief, but I may not be able to act on that. Okay, a Supreme Court case, for example, from the past had to do with a person who believed that as part of his salvation experience, he needed to have sexual intercourse with 7 virgins. Okay, does that give him the right to do that? Does it give him the right to force himself on that? Now, again, that might seem a little distasteful, but that was actually a court case that came up before the Supreme Court. Do they have the right to regulate his behavior, or can he just believe that as part of his religious experience, he needs to have sexual intercourse with 7 young girls? You might think, well, that's a pretty clear one. Okay, maybe so. But again, we can't decide this just because it's distasteful to us. These rules have to cut across lines that are not just denominational. So here's something else to think about. What is the restriction between belief and conduct? Is there a difference? In other words, if you don't let me act out my beliefs, doesn't that in some way invalidate my beliefs? Am I allowed really to believe whatever I want, but I just can't act on them? Does that not violate my very beliefs? Aren't my beliefs invalidated if I can't act them out? So for the Supreme Court to say, well, you can have these beliefs but not act on them, that creates a tension that, again, the Supreme Court is trying to work through. Probably the most famous of these is what's called the Smith case. This was Employment Division versus Smith back in the 1990s, and this is sometimes colloquially known as the peyote case. What you had were a couple of men who worked in a rehabilitation center who smoked peyote as part of their religious rites and rituals on the weekend. They were discharged from their job in a rehabilitation center, and they sued in federal court because they were denied unemployment insurance because they had been fired for workplace misconduct. They argued that their religious practices allowed them to smoke peyote and that therefore they were entitled to the workman's compensation, and not to give them workman's compensation was a violation of their free exercise. This went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court in 1990 decided that no, you're not entitled to that. And this is the idea of accommodation, the idea that a law that does not burden religion does not need to accommodate every exemption to religious beliefs. So if a law does not intentionally burden religion, like not smoking peyote in the state of Oregon, the law does not need to take into account every individual religion within that group that might say, yes, we get to do this. Well, these are just a few of the complicated issues. In the court cases you'll be looking at this week, you'll see more, and keep an open mind as you work through the issues.